The day of the show began with excitement in the air. People were lined up outside the studio, holding signs and whispering to each other about the guest they had come to see. Cameras were being tested, microphones checked, and stage assistants rushed from one corner to another to make sure everything was perfect. The audience filled the seats slowly, their faces glowing with the thrill of being part of a live broadcast. They knew this episode was going to be special, because Keanu Reeves was the star guest. When his name was announced, the studio filled with cheers. People clapped, some stood, and others raised their phones to capture the moment. Keanu walked onto the stage in his usual calm manner, not too fast, not too slow. He wore a plain black shirt, dark jeans, and his long hair brushed lightly over his shoulders. Around his neck hung a silver dog tag, shining softly under the bright studio lights. To most people, it looked like just another accessory, something small compared to his fame, but for Keanu it was something much deeper. He greeted the host with a polite smile and sat down on the couch, hands resting gently on his knees. The host for the evening was Whoopi Goldberg, loved for her humor and quick wit. She had been teasing guests for years, and the audience adored her for it. As she looked at Keanu, her eyes fell on the dog tag resting on his chest. With a playful grin, she leaned forward and pointed at it. "Keanu, what's this? Did you join the army and not tell us? Or are you starting a new fashion trend?" Her voice was light, filled with mischief, and the audience laughed right away. Keanu smiled softly, but he didn't rush to respond. Instead, he lowered his eyes to the necklace, holding it gently between his fingers as if it were something fragile. The laughter continued for a moment, but then it began to fade as people realized he wasn't laughing along. His silence was not rude, it was thoughtful, almost heavy, as if he was deciding whether to open a part of himself that he usually kept hidden. Whoopi chuckled again, trying to keep the mood light. "Come on, Keanu, you're not going to tell me you wear that just to look cool, right?" she asked, tilting her head and raising her eyebrows. The audience giggled once more, clapping at the playful joke. Some even shouted comments, expecting him to give a funny reply. But Keanu stayed quiet, eyes still lowered, his fingers brushing the edges of the metal tag. The cameras caught the expression on his face, and suddenly the room felt different. The joy and energy were still there, but they shifted into something softer, something uncertain. People stopped laughing and leaned forward in their seats, waiting. Even Whoopi noticed the change. She lowered her hands slowly, her smile softening as she studied him. Keanu finally looked up, and when he did, his eyes carried a calm seriousness that filled the room. He gave a small smile, but it was not one of amusement, it was the kind of smile people give when they are about to share something personal. His hand lingered on the dog tag as though drawing strength from it. The audience went silent. The studio that had been buzzing with laughter only seconds earlier was now so quiet that the sound of the cameras adjusting could be heard. It was rare for such a large group to go completely silent, but something about Keanu's presence made everyone pause. He hadn't even spoken yet, but his stillness commanded respect. Whoopi leaned back in her chair, folding her hands in front of her, no longer pushing the joke. She could sense that what he was about to say wasn't part of the light-hearted banter she had planned. The camera operators, too, seemed to know this moment was important, as they zoomed in closer to his face. His calm eyes, his gentle posture, and the way he touched the necklace told a story before words even came out. For Keanu, this wasn't just another accessory, and it certainly wasn't a fashion choice. The dog tag meant something to him, something connected to love, to memory, to loss. At that moment, the necklace felt like the center of the whole stage. It was a small piece of metal, but it carried more weight than anything else in the room. The audience, which had entered the studio ready for fun and entertainment, was suddenly on the edge of their seats, drawn in by the unexpected depth of the moment. They didn't know the story yet, but they could feel it coming. Some people shifted in their chairs, others clasped their hands together. Even the laughter that had been echoing through the room moments earlier now seemed distant, almost like it belonged to a different time. Keanu let out a slow breath, as if preparing himself. His calm presence made even the loudest hearts in the audience beat quieter. Everyone was waiting for him to explain the necklace, but no one wanted to rush him. He had that rare quality of making silence feel important, making people realize that not every moment needed to be filled with noise. Meanwhile, Whoopi, who was known for always having the last word, stayed quiet too. She was watching him carefully, her playful smile gone, replaced with an expression of curiosity and respect. She hadn't expected her light joke to turn into something so serious, but she was wise enough to know when to step back and let a guest take control of the moment. The studio lights shone down on Keanu, reflecting off the silver dog tag. The camera angle widened, showing him sitting calmly with the necklace resting in his hand, the audience watching in silence, and Whoopi leaning back with an expression that showed she too was caught up in the unexpected seriousness of the situation. That was how part one of the story unfolded. A live TV show, filled with noise, laughter, and energy, suddenly transformed into something more intimate and human, all because of one small necklace, one playful joke, and one man's quiet presence. It was clear to everyone in the room that Keanu Reeves was about to reveal something deeply personal, something that would change the mood of the entire show. The laughter that had once filled the studio began to feel thinner, almost uncertain. People were still smiling, but the sound of their voices had lowered, as if they sensed that something was shifting. Whoopi, still trying to keep the energy high, leaned forward again. She raised her eyebrows in her signature playful way, pointing toward the silver tag resting on Keanu's chest. "So tell us, Keanu," she said, chuckling lightly, "what's the story here? You look like a teenager trying to impress the cool kids with that thing." The audience laughed again, but this time it wasn't as full or natural as before. The giggles felt lighter, as though people weren't sure if it was okay to laugh anymore. They were watching Keanu closely, waiting to see what he would do. He didn't laugh, and he didn't joke back. Instead, he reached up slowly and held the tag between his fingers, the way someone might hold something delicate and precious. His thumb rubbed over the engraved letters, and his face softened in a way that made the audience's laughter die out almost instantly. The silence spread across the studio like a wave. People exchanged glances, wondering if they had crossed a line without meaning to. Whoopi herself stopped mid-laugh and pulled back, her expression shifting from playful to careful. She had teased countless guests in the past, but rarely had she been met with such quiet seriousness in response. For the first time that evening, she hesitated, unsure if she should say more. The cameras zoomed in close to Keanu's face. His long hair fell slightly over his forehead as he looked down at the necklace. His lips pressed together, and for a moment it seemed like he might stay silent. But even his silence spoke loudly. There was weight in it, a heaviness that filled the air and made the audience lean forward in their seats. The sound of shuffling feet and the faint hum of the studio lights became clear, because no one dared to speak. Keanu's hand tightened gently around the necklace, and he lifted his eyes toward the crowd. His gaze was not sharp or angry, but it carried a quiet strength that silenced every whisper. The people in the front row could see the faint shine of emotion in his eyes, though he tried to keep his expression calm. It was clear that whatever the dog tag meant, it wasn't something to laugh about. Whoopi shifted in her chair, her body language changing. Instead of leaning forward with humor, she leaned back slightly, her smile fading into a look of respect. She raised her hands in a small gesture, as if to say she hadn't meant harm. The audience noticed, and their expressions softened too. What started as a playful moment was quickly becoming something much deeper, something that no one had expected when they tuned into the show that night. Keanu still hadn't spoken, but his actions were enough to make the room feel different. He let the tag dangle between his fingers and then placed his hand flat over it, holding it against his chest. The gesture was so simple, yet it spoke volumes. It said that this object was close to his heart, both literally and emotionally. The cameras caught it, and people at home watching on television would later say they could feel the weight of that silence through the screen. The audience, once full of laughter and chatter, now sat frozen, waiting for him to say something. But Keanu didn't rush. He seemed to be thinking carefully, as though choosing whether to open up or keep his story private. His calm, slow way of holding himself gave the moment even more power. Unlike most celebrities who might crack a joke or deflect attention, Keanu leaned into the stillness. He let it breathe. One man in the crowd coughed softly, breaking the silence for a split second, but even that sound felt out of place, almost like an interruption to a sacred moment. The man quickly lowered his head, embarrassed, while the rest of the audience continued watching in complete quiet. Whoopi cleared her throat softly, almost whispering now. "I was just teasing, Keanu," she said with sincerity in her tone. "I didn't know it was something important." Her words hung in the air, and everyone knew she wasn't trying to be funny anymore. She was acknowledging the shift, acknowledging that what seemed like a simple joke had uncovered something unexpected. Keanu nodded gently, not with anger, but with an understanding smile. Still, he didn't speak right away. He let his hand rest on the tag for another long moment. The camera cut to audience members, showing people with softened eyes, their laughter gone, their faces full of curiosity and sympathy. Some clutched their own necklaces or rings, as if reminded of something personal in their own lives. The silence became almost heavy, but not uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that happens in a church or at a memorial, the kind where everyone knows they are sharing something meaningful without words. The dog tag, once just a shiny piece of metal hanging around his neck, had now become the center of the entire room. It carried a mystery, and everyone could sense that it was tied to a story of love, loss, or memory. Finally, Keanu's shoulders rose slightly as he drew in a deep breath. His lips parted, and though no words came out yet, the audience reacted as though they had been given a gift. They leaned closer, waiting, their eyes fixed on him. Whoopi tilted her head, her expression gentle, ready to listen. But before he spoke, Keanu gave a small smile again, the kind that carried both sadness and strength. He looked at the tag one last time, then let it drop softly against his chest. The metal clinked lightly, the sound echoing in the silence like a tiny bell. That faint noise seemed to signal that he was finally ready to speak, and the audience held their breath, ready for whatever he was about to share. At that exact moment, the atmosphere in the studio had completely transformed. What had started as a lively, playful segment was now something people would never forget. The air was thick with emotion, with curiosity, and with respect. The audience didn't want a joke anymore, they wanted truth. They wanted to know what story lived inside that small piece of metal that Keanu treated with such care. And Keanu, with his calm and humble way, was about to give them an answer that would leave not only the studio but also the viewers at home in complete silence. Keanu lifted his head slowly, his calm eyes scanning the room. The crowd leaned forward, holding their breath. The silver dog tag swayed slightly against his chest as his hand lowered, but his fingers still brushed it gently, as if it were a bridge between memory and the present moment. He opened his mouth, and when he finally spoke, his voice was steady and soft, yet carried a weight that filled the entire studio. "This isn't just a necklace," he began. The room grew even quieter, as though the air itself was listening. "It's a reminder. It belonged to someone I cared about deeply, someone who is no longer here." The words were simple, but they carried an emotion that pierced through every person in the room. The audience, who had moments ago laughed at jokes, now sat frozen in silence. Some lowered their heads, as if showing respect. Others kept their eyes fixed on him, unable to look away. The camera zoomed in closer, capturing the faint shine in his eyes that he tried to control. He took a deep breath and continued. When you lose someone important, the world doesn't feel the same. You wake up each day carrying both their memory and their absence. This dog tag, it keeps them close to me. It helps me remember the love we shared, the moments we had, and it gives me strength on the days when life feels heavy. The studio seemed to hold its breath with him. Even Whoopi, who had begun the moment with light-hearted teasing, now sat with her hands folded in her lap, her expression softened into quiet sympathy. She didn't interrupt, didn't try to make another joke. She simply listened, along with everyone else. Keanu shifted slightly in his seat, his hand tightening around the dog tag again. People often see things like this and think they're just accessories, just something for style. But for me, it's not about fashion. It's about memory. It's about love that doesn't end, even if the person is gone. The audience absorbed his words slowly, as if each sentence touched something personal inside them. It wasn't just about his story anymore, it was about everyone who had ever lost someone they loved. They could feel his honesty, and it connected them to their own experiences. Keanu looked down for a moment, his hair falling slightly forward, then lifted his head again with a faint smile. When I touch it, I remember their laughter. I remember their kindness. I remember the little things that made them who they were. It helps me keep moving forward, to live in a way that honors them. A woman in the front row wiped a tear from her cheek quietly. Others clasped their hands together, nodding faintly as if they understood exactly what he meant. The cameras panned across the audience, showing faces that were no longer smiling but filled with emotion. Whoopi finally spoke, her voice soft, almost a whisper. I didn't know, Keanu. I thought it was just jewelry. I didn't mean to. Her words trailed off, and she pressed her lips together, her usual boldness replaced by genuine humility. Keanu gave her a small, forgiving smile. It's okay, he said gently. Most people don't know. We all carry things with us that others can't see. Sometimes it's a necklace. Sometimes it's just in our hearts. But everyone has something. Those last words landed heavily in the room. People nodded, recognizing the truth in what he said. It wasn't just about him, it was about everyone. Everyone carries unseen stories, unseen pain, unseen memories. He leaned back slightly, his hand still resting on the dog tag. I wear this not to draw attention but to remind myself. It tells me to live kindly, to treat others with respect, and to remember that life is short and precious. It reminds me that love is what really matters in the end. The audience was silent, their eyes locked on him. The energy of the room had transformed completely. It no longer felt like a talk show filled with jokes and applause. It felt like a gathering of people sharing something sacred. Even the crew members, who were usually busy adjusting cameras and lights, stood still. They knew this was not just another segment, it was a moment that would be remembered long after the show ended. Keanu's words flowed slowly, but they carried power. We live in a world that often moves too fast. We get caught up in work, in fame, in things that don't last. But when you've lost someone, you realize how fragile everything is. That's when you start to treasure the little things more, the smile of a friend, a kind word, a quiet evening. That's what this necklace reminds me to do, to treasure what I still have while I can. The audience sat in silence, some holding their breath, others blinking back tears. The laughter that had started the moment now felt like it belonged to another world. In its place was something deeper, something real. Whoopi leaned forward slowly, her voice softer than anyone had ever heard on her show. Thank you for sharing that, she said. Her words were simple, but they carried the weight of respect. She knew she had poked at something sacred, and she was grateful he chose to open his heart instead of shutting down. Keanu nodded, his expression calm but filled with quiet strength. He wasn't angry, he wasn't bitter. He was simply honest, and that honesty had turned the studio into a place of reflection. In that moment, no one clapped, no one laughed. The silence was powerful, almost holy. It was a silence that said, "We understand, we respect, we feel it too." Keanu placed the dog tag gently back against his chest, letting it rest there. The cameras lingered on him for a few more seconds, capturing the way he carried himself with humility, with dignity, and with love. Everyone in the studio knew they had witnessed something special. It wasn't planned, it wasn't scripted, but it was real. And real moments are the ones that stay with people the longest. The air in the studio felt different now. It was as if the playful atmosphere had dissolved, replaced with something much deeper, something everyone could feel in their chest. Keanu sat quietly for a moment after speaking, his hands still resting on the dog tag, his eyes thoughtful. The silence that filled the room wasn't uncomfortable, it was powerful. It was the kind of silence that comes when people are touched by something true. The audience, who had come expecting fun stories and light jokes, now found themselves drawn into an emotional experience they hadn't planned for. Some people shifted in their seats slowly, trying to absorb the weight of his words. Others kept their eyes fixed on him, afraid to miss a single expression or movement. Even the crew members behind the cameras stood a little straighter, their usual routine forgotten as they too listened with respect. Keanu finally looked up again, his voice calm but steady. He didn't rush his words. "I think sometimes we forget that everyone we meet is carrying something," he said softly. "It might not be visible. It might not be spoken. But it's there. And often, the things they carry are heavy. That's why I try to treat people kindly, no matter who they are." The audience nodded silently. Many of them had experienced their own quiet struggles, loss, heartbreak, challenges that no one else could see. In his words, they felt recognized. It was rare for a celebrity of his stature to speak so openly, not about fame or success, but about grief and compassion. Whoopi, who had begun with playful teasing, now leaned closer, her expression serious. Her voice carried no jokes, only respect. "You're right," she said softly. "We really don't know what people are holding inside. Thank you for reminding us." She paused, then added, "I think your words just changed the whole room." Keanu gave a small smile, but it wasn't meant to draw attention. It was quiet, almost shy, as if he didn't want to make himself the focus. Instead, he looked toward the audience again and continued. "This necklace," he said, holding the tag once more, "isn't just about remembering someone I lost. It's also a reminder to live in a way that honors them. To be present. To be kind. To give the best of myself, because I know they would want that." The audience reacted with a low murmur of agreement, though no one clapped yet. Applause didn't feel right in that moment. People simply nodded, some wiping at their eyes. The camera zoomed in on faces in the crowd, men and women both, who were visibly moved. One older man in the back row leaned forward, pressing his hands together as though in prayer. A young woman in the front clutched the edge of her seat, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. Keanu's voice softened further, carrying the weight of his own journey. "I think we live in a world that moves too quickly. People forget to slow down, to appreciate what they have. But when you've experienced loss, you realize how fragile it all is. Every moment becomes more precious." His words spread through the room like a gentle wave. People weren't just listening to him, they were remembering their own lives, their own loved ones, their own fragile moments. That was the power of what he was sharing. It was no longer only his story. It had become everyone's story. Whoopi placed her hand over her chest, her usual bright energy replaced with quiet sincerity. She looked at him with respect, her eyes shining in a way the audience rarely saw. "Keanu," she said softly, "you didn't just answer a question. You gave us a lesson tonight." The audience murmured again, agreeing. This wasn't just television anymore, it was something far more meaningful. Keanu gave another small smile, almost embarrassed by the attention, and shook his head gently. "I'm not trying to give lessons," he said quietly. "I'm just sharing what life has taught me. We all have our own stories, our own ways of remembering the people who matter. For me, it happens to be this necklace. For someone else, it might be a photograph, a song, a place. But it's all the same, it's love." At that moment, the room felt almost sacred. The dog tag, once a small, unnoticed accessory, had become a symbol that carried not only Keanu's story but also the emotions of everyone who was listening. People who had entered the studio as strangers now felt connected by shared understanding. Even the applause sign, which usually lit up to remind the audience when to cheer, remained dark. No one needed to be told how to respond. Respect filled the air naturally, without instruction. For Whoopi, who had built her career on quick jokes and lightheartedness, it was rare to be silent for so long. But she knew this was not her moment, it was his. She sat back, her eyes never leaving him, giving him the space to speak. Keanu lowered his hand, letting the dog tag rest again against his chest. He drew in a slow breath, then exhaled, as though releasing some of the weight he carried. His words had not only moved the audience but also seemed to bring him a kind of peace. Sharing the story, opening up about something so personal, had given the memory new life. The audience stayed quiet, respecting that peace. Some wiped tears discreetly, others simply sat still, holding on to the feeling of the moment. There was no rush to move on, no desire to break the silence. Everyone wanted to stay in that space a little longer, to carry the lesson deeper into themselves. The cameras captured everything: the soft glow of the lights, the stillness of the audience, the quiet strength on Keanu's face. Viewers at home would later say that even through their screens, they felt the silence, the emotion, the sincerity. After what felt like a long pause, someone in the back of the audience began clapping softly. It was not loud, not demanding. It was gentle, respectful, almost like a thank you. Slowly, others joined in, the applause building but never turning into a wild cheer. It remained calm, heartfelt, and deeply human. Keanu lowered his head slightly, acknowledging the gesture with humility. He didn't raise his arms or bask in the attention. He simply nodded once, his eyes soft, his demeanor as humble as always. Whoopi leaned forward again, her voice still quiet. "I think I speak for everyone here when I say thank you," she said. "Not just for being here, but for trusting us with something so personal." Keanu nodded again, his voice steady but gentle. "Thank you for listening." And with those few words, the moment settled into the hearts of everyone present. It wasn't just a segment on a show anymore, it was a memory, one that each person would carry with them long after the cameras stopped rolling. The silence lingered for a few more moments after Keanu's final words. It wasn't an awkward pause, but one filled with respect. People in the studio seemed unwilling to break it, as though they were holding on to the quiet beauty of what had just happened. The dog tag, now resting softly against Keanu's chest, had transformed the entire atmosphere. Something that had started as a playful joke had turned into one of the most profound moments in the show's history. Finally, the audience began to clap, but it wasn't the kind of loud, excited applause one usually heard in a live broadcast. It was slower, softer, and filled with emotion. The clapping rose gently like a wave, steady and sincere, until the whole studio echoed with it. Some people even stood, not out of habit, but because they felt compelled to show their respect. The applause was not for a performance or a funny story, it was for the honesty, the vulnerability, and the quiet strength Keanu had shown. Whoopi reached across and placed her hand gently on his. Her usual wit and quick humor had been replaced by sincerity. "Thank you for sharing that with us," she said softly. Her voice, usually bold and strong, trembled just slightly, revealing how deeply she had been moved. "I teased you without knowing the meaning, and you answered with more grace than I deserved." Keanu gave her a small smile, warm and forgiving. "It's okay," he replied simply. "You didn't know. None of us can see what someone else is carrying. That's why I don't take it personally. We're all human." His words landed with a quiet power. The audience nodded, touched by the humility in his response. He hadn't embarrassed Whoopi or made her feel guilty. Instead, he had turned the moment into a lesson about compassion. That humility was part of what made him so admired, not just as an actor, but as a man. The applause began to fade, but the emotion in the room remained. People shifted in their seats, some with tears still in their eyes, others smiling gently at the thought that they had just witnessed something rare. They knew this wasn't scripted. It wasn't staged. It was real. And real moments like this were what people remembered long after the cameras stopped rolling. The show slowly moved on, but the energy never returned to the lightheartedness it had before. Even when the conversation shifted to other topics, Keanu's films, his career, his projects, the weight of the necklace remained in the room. Everything he said afterward carried more meaning, because people had seen the heart behind the man. When the cameras finally turned off and the taping ended, the audience stayed in their seats longer than usual. Many of them whispered to each other, sharing how deeply they had been moved. Some said they would never look at a simple object the same way again. Others admitted that his words had reminded them of someone they had lost, someone they wanted to honor in their own way. Whoopi stood and gave Keanu a small hug before he left the stage. It wasn't a big, dramatic gesture, but it was heartfelt. The cameras were off by then, but those who saw it knew it was genuine. She whispered something in his ear, and he nodded, giving her that quiet smile that had already touched so many hearts. As Keanu walked backstage, the silver dog tag bounced gently against his chest with each step. Crew members who usually went about their business paused to watch him pass. Some nodded to him respectfully, others gave him quiet smiles. They, too, had been moved. In their world of rehearsals, scripts, and bright lights, they rarely saw such raw honesty on stage. Outside the studio, news of the moment spread quickly. Clips were shared online, and people across the world watched the video of Keanu explaining the meaning of the dog tag. Comments poured in from viewers who said they cried while watching, who said they felt seen, who said his words gave them comfort. The story was no longer just about a celebrity on a talk show. It became a reminder to millions of people about love, loss, and the unseen stories that each person carries. For the people in the studio that night, it was something they would never forget. They had come expecting laughter and entertainment, and they got that, but they also received something far more valuable, a moment of truth. Backstage, Keanu sat quietly for a few minutes before leaving. He wasn't one to seek attention for emotional moments. He didn't talk about how powerful it had been, and he didn't boast about how the audience had reacted. Instead, he sat with his thoughts, touched the dog tag once more, and whispered something to himself that no one else could hear. The driver waiting for him outside opened the door, and Keanu stepped into the night. The cool air brushed against his face, and he looked up at the sky for a moment before getting into the car. The city lights sparkled around him, but his thoughts were far away. For him, the necklace was not about television, applause, or headlines. It was about memory, love, and carrying someone close, even when they were gone. Meanwhile, in homes across the world, people who had watched the clip were having their own quiet moments. Some picked up an old photograph of a loved one. Others put on a piece of jewelry they hadn't worn in years. A few even called family members they hadn't spoken to in a while. Keanu's words had touched something universal, the reminder that life is short, and love is what lasts. The talk show episode was replayed many times, but every time viewers reached the moment with the dog tag, the energy changed. People would go silent, listening carefully, even if they had already seen it before. It became more than just a clip, it became a piece of wisdom people wanted to revisit. In the weeks that followed, Whoopi mentioned the moment in another interview. She admitted that what started as a joke had become one of the most powerful lessons she had learned on her show. "He reminded me," she said softly, "that everyone has a story. And sometimes, the smallest thing like a necklace can hold the biggest meaning." That was the lasting power of the moment. Not just the silence it created in the studio, but the echoes it left behind in people's hearts. It reminded them to look at each other with more kindness, to realize that every smile might hide a story, and every person might be carrying a memory that gives their life meaning. Keanu never spoke much about it afterward. He wasn't interested in turning the moment into publicity. He didn't need to. For him, it was simply a part of his truth, shared honestly when the time was right. But for everyone else, it was something unforgettable. That night, the dog tag wasn't just metal. It wasn't just a piece of jewelry. It became a symbol for love, for memory, for compassion, and for the unseen battles people carry every day. And as Keanu Reeves walked out of the studio into the cool evening air, he carried not only his own memories but also the silent respect of everyone who had witnessed his truth.